as well as for the newly created Chinese domestic firms to utilize them as well. And so, looking at the impacts that some of these reforms had, you can look on the left here. This is the percentage of industrial output that came from state-owned enterprises, starting from that first major wave of reforms in 1983 and going to 2003. You can see it falls from nearly 75% to only about 10% by 2003. And this is the percentage of state-owned enterprise workers of all employees in China. And it should be remembered that these SOE workers are pretty much only urban workers. And as this process goes on, more and more of China is becoming part of the urban industrial workforce. And so you see that there's a decline from around 17% in 1994 to around 8% in 2007. That's against a general increase in the degree to which workers in China were industrial workers. So it's not just the decline in of itself, it's a decline against an increasing number of total industrial workers. This is a percentage of the whole country, including rural workers. And so what does this look like in terms of urban employment? 1995, which is the start of that big second wave of sort of full-scale privatizations and layoffs and reforms, you have state-owned enterprise workers are about 60% of the urban workforce. Workers at collectively owned factories are about 15%, and workers at privately owned factories are about 25%. Now, looking forward to 2006, you see that the situation has completely reversed itself. State-owned enterprises employed only about 20% of the workforce. The collectively owned industries employed only about 5%, and nearly 3/4 of Chinese workers in 2006 were employed by, in the urban areas, were employed by private firms. In terms of the number of enterprises, by the end of 2001, you saw about 86% of all of the state-owned enterprises had been restructured, and about 70% of those had been partially or fully privatized. So it's really an incredibly dramatic shift between the start of that second major reform wave in 1995 and the early 2000s. You see a complete reversal of the situation in China in terms of the role of state-owned enterprise and the role of private industry. Additionally, during this period, you had the integration of Hong Kong in 1997, which sort of was integrated as a pre-built special economic zone with extensive links to existing Western companies and Western countries, with an existing marketplace, with an existing liberalized trade system. And this was a major accelerator in the pace of this project. It also is something that's interesting to us because historically, when even a deformed or degenerated worker state sort of took over additional territory, it was obliged to actually carry out a socialization of property in that territory because the bureaucracy was incapable of sharing power in the long term with a capitalist class. In the end, there had to be that carrying out of some kind of nationalization. Whereas in this case, what you see is not only is private property in Hong Kong preserved, it's sort of integrated eagerly as a model for reform across the rest of China. One thing I should bring up that I'd skipped over is the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. The protest movement that led into Tiananmen it's a pretty complicated movement. It did include not just the sort of political demands for democratic rights that are usually mentioned in Western recountings of the event, but it also included a lot of responses to the changes that were happening in employment, in healthcare, and in state benefits as a result of these changes. And the crushing of the isolation of that movement from the rural peasantry and then its crushing is a big factor in allowing the reform process to continue moving forward. Talking a little more about healthcare specifically, I already discussed a little bit about how the rural healthcare system had been dismantled. For urban workers, health services were usually provided through benefits provided to them at the state-owned enterprises, and these were replaced in some cases with nothing, in some cases with much more meager state benefits. Later on, there were some very large protests in China around the early 2000s, as basically almost everybody in China had to pay out of pocket for almost every expense. After the dismantling of this, anybody who worked for a private firm, anybody who worked as a rural worker, and you had several cases where you had people dying because they weren't able to afford a medical procedure that resulted in wide-scale protests. You also had the SARS epidemic and the fallout from that. And this prompted really large waves of discontent and protest, and the Chinese government was eventually forced to establish a sort of national basic health insurance system, although it still only covered about 40 to about 50% or so of actual healthcare spending in China. It varies by year, but it's generally between 40 and 60%. And this situation, to a large extent, still continues today. Private spending as a whole is about 40 to 50% of healthcare spending, and out-of-pocket expenditures are about 36% of all healthcare spending in China in 2018. There is a small but growing private insurance market as well. It's been pretty heavily encouraged by the state as sort of a supplement to their to the public healthcare system, which does not cover a lot of different procedures and is very limited in its extent. And there's similar processes that go on in other benefits and areas associated with the Iron Rice Bowl. In education, the rural education system at the time was really gutted, and it's only very slowly started to be replaced. There was a more rapid replacement of systems in the cities, in terms of pension systems, in terms of sort of all of the package of benefits that Chinese workers had enjoyed were very much all either slashed or shifted to private forms or both. The early 2000s really sees a sort of legal recognition of the changes that had been happening in practice leading up to that point. In 2001, and then extended with a decision in 2002, capitalists were formally allowed to join the Chinese Communist Party. In 2004, there was a constitutional reform that formally guaranteed private property rights. And then in 2007, there was a new property law enacted that spelled out a lot of the terms and conditions for those private property rights. You often see a sort of legal fiction that maintains the language of socialism in China, but does not maintain any of the practical effect of it. So, for example, there is some private land ownership in China, but not very much in terms of formal ownership of the land. But you can get, a 50-year lease at extremely low cost, and which grants you the rights to do, to a large extent, whatever you want on it. And so most private companies don't actually formally own the land that they're on, but they have a 40 or 50-year lease on it that in practice allows them to own it. And so this is sort of the story of how China restores capitalism. It breaks the alliance between the working class and peasantry. It creates this flood of rural workers that allow for the introduction of these reforms to be done with less economic and political resistance, and it carries out a wholesale transformation of the state-owned enterprises in China. And this process was heavily influenced by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Specifically, the Chinese bureaucracy could see that collapse happening and could learn from it, and could see the economic disaster and enormous political chaos that befell Russia in the aftermath of that collapse. And it was determined to avoid that and to carry out this very tightly controlled restructuring that allowed for a restoration of capitalism without the formal collapse of the state apparatus, without the flag changing, without there being some incredible singular decisive shock. Instead, it was carried out in this sort of series of shocks through these reform measures. So this leaves China in the early 2000s as still a quite poor capitalist country, but one in which there is a pretty significant difference from most other capitalist countries in the world. And it's very unusual for new imperialist powers to form. And the logic for that is